all for being here tonight. We really appreciate you joining us to hear some salmon stories from Amy and learning and celebrating about the Salmon Way. So Salmon State, for those who don't know, we're an Alaska-based nonprofit organization. We have an office here in Juneau, as well as up in Anchorage. And our mission is simply to make sure that wild salmon continue to thrive in Alaska and that Alaska does remain a salmon state for future generations. So we do a lot of work on habitat conservation and just advocating for fish-friendly policies around Alaska. I'd like to extend a big thank you to the State Libraries and Archives and Museum and friends of SLAM. We just really appreciate you all sharing your beautiful space with us tonight, so thank you. Also want to thank, we had quite a few co-sponsors and community partners that helped us make this evening possible and helped us bring Amy and the Salmon Way exhibit here to Juneau this month and February as well. Those sponsors include Barnacle, Braided River, Taku River Reds, Taku Smokeries, Uncruise Adventures, and as well as Commercial Fishermen for Bristol Bay and Salmon Beyond Borders. So a big thank you to our very generous sponsors. We're also really honored tonight to have maybe several lawmakers with us. I know we at least have one representative, and just we're really appreciative to them just for their leadership in the legislature. They're doing incredibly hard and important work every day to protect the things that wild salmon need, such as clean water and healthy habitat. So I'd like to invite Representative Sarah Hannon from Juneau up to say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And if I don't know you, I have the honor of representing Juneau in the legislature, but also some of the best fishing grounds in Southeast. So the Northern Lynn Canal, Gillnet Grounds, Taku Inlet, the Fairweather Grounds, and Icy Straits, so some fabulous fishing grounds. I grew up north, though, on the land of the Knaitse people. I grew up in Cooper Landing in Anchorage, and in our cabin on East Quartz Creek, Kenai River is famous for king salmon, and in my childhood, you could still catch king salmon in the lake and in the creek. And the goal was that you spent the summer catching a fish as big as you, and to see how many years you could go. So there's a whole series of childhood pictures of each of us laying in the sand next to the catch to see where you were in the lineup. I knew early on, though, that I was missing something genetically, because my sisters and my mother and my father had the gene that if it was daybreak and there was any salmon, they should be fishing. I was particularly interested in looking around, making things in the sand, figuring out what the fish had eaten. I happened to marry a man who I recognized right away had that gene for driven by the fish. So 365 days a year, if fishing is going on, he is on top of it. I happen to get the accessory side. I own more fish jewelry than I do anything else. I have a million ways to think about fish, to decorate with fish, and to live in the salmon way. I do appreciate black cod and halibut, but salmon is what drives the fish market in my family, the fishing that drives most of us out in bad weather. I happen to be a completely fair weather fisherman, and again, my husband would say I'm not really a fisherman, I'm just there for the rod count. He has to tell me to pay attention and change the bait, things like that. I'm happy to take credit for it, I'm happy to eat it, and I am very happy to see beautiful pictures showing the life cycle, and think this is one of the most incredible pictures I have ever seen, that Amy has been able to capture the vitality that salmon bring to each of us and to the ecosystem that we share with Ursa Major. And thank you all for being here, living in the salmon state, in the Salmon Way, and making sure you're keeping your nutritional values up in the time of coronavirus by eating healthy salmon at least 5 times a week. So.
Thank you, Representative Hannon. And just before I introduce Amy, the reason why we're all here, just a couple things. You'll notice on your seats there's a postcard And that's sort of your homework. And hopefully not while Amy's talking, but, as you'll hear from Amy, she traveled around the state of Alaska for a few years, talking with Alaskans about their relationship with wild salmon and collecting stories and photos along the way. And so these postcards are just an invitation to you all to think about what are your salmon stories. And we encourage you to write your favorite salmon story down. Could be here tonight, or you can also post it on social media and tag us, Salmon State AK. We're just trying to gather Alaskan salmon stories as a way to celebrate the Salmon Way. So please take the postcard with you, fill it out tonight if you want, or another time when you're inspired. Lastly, I'll just say that after Amy's presentation, there will be time for question and answer and discussion. And after that, we have some salmon snacks and other local foods to share with you and other treats. So please stick around afterwards. Amy will be here signing copies of her book, The Salmon Way, as well. So we encourage you guys to stick around and visit with us afterwards. So with that, I'll introduce Amy Gulick, who many of you might know her for her first book, Salmon in the Trees, about the Tongass National Rainforest that we all know and love so well here. And she's just an award-winning photographer and writer. Her work's been featured in many publications, and she's a fellow with let's see if I get this right, the International League of Conservation Photographers, and she's been really tremendous ambassador for wild salmon and all of us who value and depend on wild salmon. So with that, I'd like to welcome Amy.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and I thank all of you for making the time to be here. We were a little concerned. It's like, are people still going to be gathering, given what's going on with the coronavirus? It's hard to know. So again, I appreciate you being here. Salmon have brought us together here tonight, and while many of us may or may not know each other, we might leave here with stronger connections to one another, to the fish, to where the fish live, and the people who live with them. So I always like to give thanks to the salmon for helping us make these connections. Just real quick, show of hands, is there anybody in the audience who does not live in Alaska? Oh boy. Okay, so I have a little confession to make. I'm always a little nervous when I give a talk here in Alaska because contrary to what most people believe, including my husband, I don't live here. I live in Washington State. I live on a little small island in Washington's Puget Sound, but I do spend a lot of time here. But that makes me one of those dreaded outsiders, and I'm very well aware how Alaskans feel about outsiders and outside views, and with good reason, I might add. But I have to say, I have never experienced that kind of outsider angst towards me. And when I was working on this book and when I was working on my first book as well, everywhere I went, Alaskans just went out of their way. They were gracious, kind, went above and beyond the call of duty, and in particular for this book, during their busiest time of year, to help a stranger. They didn't know me, I didn't know them, and they kind of just went out of their way. And I have learned that that's the Alaska way. And I've found that everywhere that I've gone. And again, want to just put that out there and thank people.
So I'm going to, sorry.
No, it's fine.
Just going to interject quickly. We're just really honored to have an additional representative here joining us tonight. So just wanted to turn the mic over really quickly to Representative Louise Stutz from Kodiak. So please welcome her.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm so tardy. I missed out on the early part here. As she said, I'm the state representative, and I represent Kodiak, Cordova, Yakutat, and several small fishing communities. And I was married to a commercial fisherman who commercially fished for 45 years. So I know the importance of salmon and how important a good, solid, healthy, sustainable salmon run is. They've been an integral part of our lives for millions of years, we just heard. And so, well, you know, and it is a renewable resource, and that's what I keep trying to reinforce at the Capitol. This is a renewable resource. Our oil is not renewable. And if we don't take it out of the ground today, it'll be there tomorrow. But if we don't take care of our salmon today and our fisheries, it will not be there tomorrow. And I'm not sure if I mentioned, I'm also the state chair for Fisheries. Thank you. It's really important to me. You know, I have had the good fortune of being the chair. This is year number 6, and I have made it my number one priority to educate, particularly people in the Capitol, how important our fisheries are and what they contribute to the economy of this state. So many people don't have any idea. But more than that, I'm really happy to be here to have an opportunity to meet the author. I was given one of her books. What an incredible book. Have you guys all read her book? And the photography, how long did it take you? 5 years. Boy, it's fabulous. I just want to say I'm honored to be here. I'm on my way to another meeting, but I could not miss the chance. And the only reason I'm late is because we had a leadership meeting at the Capitol, and I was this close to chumping them and decided maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. So I'm sorry. I guess it goes better late than never, but thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I love the book.
All right. So I'll get into my talk. So as a writer and a photographer, I tell real life stories. I don't make anything up. I don't do fiction. But how do I decide which stories to pursue? Well, sometimes I read something, or I maybe have a conversation or an experience that sparks my curiosity. And a number of years ago, I had a conversation with an Alaska Native woman in Sitka. Some of you may have known her, Terry Rothgar. She's no longer with us. But it was a very chance conversation. It was the first time I'd ever met her, and we just kind of were talking in passing. But this conversation we had, I think it really got me on the path to starting the Salmon Way. It really got me thinking. And this conversation, it's included in the book in full, but I just want to read you a little part of it now. Stroking a thick white mountain goat hide placed next to a loom, I watched master weaver Terry Rothgar create a robe traditionally made from the animal's wool. Next to the hide are strips of spruce root, raw materials for her exquisite woven basket, also on display. Terry tells stories about her Tlingit raven ancestors, and as her expert fingers weave a beautiful design. And I say to her, with such plentiful resources in your homeland, it's easy to see how your ancestors thrived. Resources? She replies. Mountain goats and trees aren't resources. We have relationships with the goat and the tree. Since time immemorial, Terry tells me, her people have lived along the forested coast of what is today southeast Alaska, rich with spruce and cedar trees, mountain goats, salmon, bears, ravens, and eagles. To make items using spruce root and cedar bark, the people carefully harvested the roots and the bark so that the trees could continue to live. And today, weavers use the same harvesting techniques. They knew the optimal time of year to hunt the mountain goat so the animal's coat was in its best condition. And in addition to mountain goat wool, they also used the hide, horns, and meat. I wonder how Terry's ancestors, thousands of years ago, had the foresight to harvest bark or roots so as not to kill the trees. The forest must have seemed endless and in a constant state of regeneration in the soggy climate. But this mindfulness speaks to the difference between resources and relationships. When people live with deep connections to the land, water, animals, and plants that sustain them, it's impossible not to respect and develop relationships with trees, goats, salmon, and more. Resources, on the other hand, tend to refer to end products, commodities. It's tough to have a relationship with lumber, copper tubing, or frozen fish sticks. So it was that chance encounter and that brief conversation with Terry about relationships that really sparked a lot of questions in my mind, and that's usually how a story starts with me, with questions. So here's a question for all of you. If I asked you what your relationship with salmon is, what would you say? And what kind of a question is that? What is your relationship with salmon? Well, it's the question that compelled me to come to Alaska and to show up at the homes, boats, and fish camps of complete strangers. I was intrigued that there's still a place in this world where the lives of people and salmon are linked. And I wanted to know what the lives of people are like who have relationships with these remarkable fish. So after several years of asking Alaskans this question, I came back with the stories and photographs that you'll find in my book. And I'll highlight just a few of them here today, but there are many more in the book. And very grateful to the people who opened their homes and their hearts and have allowed me to share their stories with you. So where to start? Well, here's a mind-boggling map of Alaska that documents close to 20,000 streams, rivers, and lakes, shown here in blue, where you can find salmon. Now, keep in mind that this number is believed to represent only a fraction of the waters actually used by salmon. And keep in mind that Alaska, as you all know, is enormous, more than twice the size of the state of Texas, our second largest state. So I'd like to point out just a few places that I'll be talking about tonight so that you can orient yourself a little bit. Let's see. So Bristol Bay down here. So the watershed, all the rivers and streams that drain into Bristol Bay, that encompasses an area about the size of the state of Kentucky. Southeast, you're all very familiar with. But if you don't know, Southeast is about the size of the state of West Virginia. And it contains very important transboundary rivers, the Taku, the Stikine, and the Unuk. And by transboundary, I mean that the headwaters are in Canada, and then they drain into the United States through Alaska. And then up here, the Kuskokwim River. So the Kuskokwim drains into what's called the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And that delta alone is the size of the state of Louisiana. And I think it's the third longest it's one of the world's largest river deltas. And then the Yukon River here, and that Yukon drains into the YK Delta there. And the Yukon, as we learned earlier, is 2,000 miles long, the third longest river in North America. It's also a transboundary river. Its headwaters are in Canada as well. But when I look at this map, what I see is a living landscape, a beating heart whose arteries of life are all of those blue waterways. Now, what you can't see on this map are the salmon pulsing through those waterways, bringing life to bears, birds, plants, people, and communities. Everywhere I went, Alaskans told me that salmon are their lifeblood. So, as many of you likely know, salmon start their lives in fresh water. They head out to the ocean to mature, and then if all goes well, they return to their freshwater birth streams as adults to spawn the next generation. And then they die. That is the life cycle of Pacific salmon. So in between the beginning and the end of their lives, a lot can happen. And at the end of their lives, they pass something on to the next generation, not unlike us. In between the beginning and end of our lives, a lot can happen. And what do we pass on? Can salmon teach us something about ourselves? So when you start poking your nose into people's relationships, you never know what you might learn. In the native village of Napaimute, I poked my head inside the low doorway of a smokehouse. It's dim with a smoky haze, but the bright orange flesh of salmon illuminates and fills the space. Shelley Leary is hanging salmon strips on double-hung racks, and she says, "I was taught to always be ready, to have food for the winter. I feel poor when I don't have food put up, and when the smokehouse is filled, I feel good because I know I have enough." So it's mid-June, and among the season's first salmon, we speak in lowered voices, respectful of the bounty before us. The aroma of smoked fish permeates my skin, clothing, and the pleasure center of my brain. And I feel a great sense of comfort, and I'm not really sure why. Never having to think much about where my food comes from or the possibility of its scarcity, how could I begin to understand Shelley's feeling of well-being that comes with a full smokehouse? So we're on the Kuskokwim River, 255 miles upstream from the mouth, and the village population here of less than 100 is seasonal, with most people, including Shelley's family, arriving when the salmon do. And the rest of the year, she lives downriver in Bethel, population 6,000, accessible only by airplane or boat. And she tells me a story of when she was in Seattle for a few days. So a friend from Alaska was with her, and they walked around the big city looking at all the tall buildings and the crowds of people. And she says, "We wondered what all those people would do when something bad happened. What would all of those people eat? We were glad we were going home soon." And that's home for Shelley. So that's the difference between my and Shelley's comfort derived from her full smokehouse. Mine is immediate gratification, delicious food right now, and hers is long-term security, food for the winter, like money in the bank. I live under the delusion that there will always be food, even though I'm not growing, fishing, hunting, or storing it. And Shelley lives under no such pretense. Who is the wiser? Who is rich? What is wealth? So Shelley is Gulick, Alaska native, and she and her family are among the 18% of Alaskans considered subsistence users of Alaska's fish and wildlife. For thousands of years, Alaska natives have fished, hunted, and gathered as a way of life. And today, approximately 130,000 rural residents, both natives and non-natives, still rely on fish and wildlife, harvesting on average close to 300 pounds per person a year, and fish account for more than half of this amount. It's really important to note there's no other place in the United States that's wild and abundant enough that a significant number of people can still live this way. So most of us are thousands of years removed from the ways of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So today's concept of subsistence in Alaska, it's often misunderstood. The word itself implies a meager existence, but most Alaskans that I met who live this way of life all told me that they consider themselves very rich people. And they fight hard to maintain the right to continue their customary and traditional ways. Now, an outsider like me could see this as a food security issue, but I've come to learn that it's much more than that. It's about people whose identities, cultures, and connections to the land, waters, their ancestors, elders, children, and each other revolve around fishing, hunting, gathering, sharing, and respecting food and where it comes from, and teaching the next generations to do the same. Salmon bring people together, and they keep people together. 3 generations of this family gather at their fish camp on the Kuskokwim River. So meet another family from Juneau in Southeast, whose 3 generations gather because of salmon. So Heather Hardcastle, she's standing in the middle, wearing the yellow suspenders. And Heather tells me that her fondest childhood memory is riding in a skiff in the long twilight of an Alaska summer evening. With salt spray and the smell of spruce trees in the air, the boat whisked her to see spawning salmon near the Taku River. And she says, "I'll never forget the joy that I felt dragging my hands through the water, touching the backs of all those beautiful fish as sheer granite peaks towered over us." So Heather's parents, Pete and Sheila on the left there, so they fished the Taku River and they sold salmon commercially in the summers. And they brought young Heather, her brother, and the family dog along on their boat, named for Heather, named the Heather Ann. And Heather says she grew up eating salmon every day in every way. So baked, boiled, in burgers, salads, and even salmon pie. And it wasn't until she left Alaska to attend college in North Carolina that she fully appreciated the abundance of salmon that still exists in her home state and the way of life it allows commercial fishermen to live. Heather's husband, Kirk, is sitting in front of her there and with their daughter, Kieli. And Kirk is an ocean and a seafood lover from Northern California. And he grew up in a culture that revolves around high-quality, locally produced cuisine. So when he came to Alaska and he began commercially fishing with Heather's dad, he quickly saw the potential to bring superb fish directly to restaurants, specialty markets, and consumers who wanted that direct connection with their food and the fishermen. So together with two friends, Renee and Winston on the right there with their daughter Athena, they formed a company called Taku River Reds. This is a company that prides itself on honoring both the fish and the fishermen by providing high-quality wild Alaska salmon and supporting a way of life for fishing families. Taku River Reds has since changed ownership, but it's still locally owned by fishing families here in Juneau. So Heather, she advises an international coalition called Salmon Beyond Borders that works to conserve her home stream, the Taku River, along with other transboundary salmon rivers that straddle the United States-Canada border. This is the mouth of the Stikine River, one of the transboundary rivers here. And she tells me, these rivers are our lifeblood. My dad has always said to evaluate any proposed activity or development through the lens of salmon. Whatever is good for salmon is going to be good for the environment, community, and economy. And I've been fortunate to spend time with Heather's family, sharing delicious salmon, laughter, and hopes for the future. Grateful for the life that salmon have given them, Heather and Kirk are raising their daughter Kieli on salmon every day in every way. And in the long twilight of summer near the Taku River, they ride by skiff to the place where the salmon and their family have always gathered. So for thousands of years, people have always gathered where there are salmon. Now, in Bristol Bay in southwest Alaska, the annual return of the world's largest run of sockeye salmon triggered a great migration of native people who came for the seasonal bounty and to renew ties with family and friends. Today, the migration of both salmon and people continues in Bristol Bay, home for the past century to a thriving commercial fishery. People come for the seasonal bounty and to renew ties with family and friends. So Melanie Brown, she's on the left there in red, and she's migrated with her family to Bristol Bay every one of her 50 summers. And the rest of the year, Melanie lives right here in Juneau, and hopefully she will join us a little later. So Melanie is Alaska native. Her ancestors are Yupik, Aleut, and Nupiaq, and she inherited her great-grandfather's commercial fishing site near the Naknek River. This is one of 9 rivers that feeds into Bristol Bay. So there are 2 ways to fish commercial fish in Bristol Bay, set netting and drift netting. Melanie is a set netter. So set netters, they fish close to shore from a fixed location, and many use skiffs to help them pull the net in. Drift netters use bigger boats, and they can fish anywhere within the legal boundaries. Now, some set netters don't use boats, and they fish from the beach. And as one beach set netter told me, most of the time, it's plain, hard, miserable work. In the cold, in the wind, in the rough waters, in the rain, in the mud, with bugs, little sleep, and improper nourishment for days on end. So the Bristol Bay fishery is intense. Why? Well, an enormous volume of salmon pulses into the bay in just a short period of time. And since the 1960s, an average of 33 million fish return every year. And the season I visited, close to 60 million fish returned. Now, most salmon runs in Alaska happen over the course of about 4 to 6 weeks. But here in Bristol Bay, 80 to 90% of the run comes in just 20 days. So with salmon showing up en masse and limited hours to catch them, it's all hands on deck. And sleep is not something that one can afford to do much of during the short season. So for Melanie in the middle, commercial fishing in Bristol Bay, it's a business, but it's rooted in family. Her dad captains his drift boat. Her sister's family fishes their own set net site. And Melanie and her mother is on the left, and her mother's in her 70s. They fish their 2 set net sites together. And Melanie's daughter, Mari, on the right, who was 14 at the time, she had just started fishing the season that I visited. And Melanie tells me, I feel like I'm living a legacy, a continuation of a river flowing in time. The Naknek is my family's home stream, and I'm grateful that it has given us life for so long. I want that to continue for my children and their children. I spent a day on Melanie's skiff watching just how physically demanding set netting can be. Everything on Melanie's boat is muscle powered. There's no mechanical gear. So set, pull, pick the net, repeat for 6 to 8 hours, rest in between fishing openings, and do it all again, the next tide and the next, until the season ends. And at the end of the day, Melanie invites me to the family home for a dinner of moose spaghetti and birthday cake for her 8-year-old son Oliver, who's down there on the right amidst all those women. And I ask the family, what does salmon mean to you? And the answers come rapid fire. Food, home, family, opportunity, education, blessing, and work ethic. Melanie tells me that she was young. She started asking fundamental questions. I think questions that we all start asking at some point. What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? And she says, there are certain events that mark our lives, and at the end, that's it. But there's the hope that we're passing something on, too. You look at salmon and how much they pass on, not only to their offspring, but to the whole system that they're a part of and benefit. I think a human who has lived life well does that, too. So we've seen how salmon benefit people who catch and sell them for their livelihood and people who rely on them for a substantial part of their diet and their culture as well. They also benefit people who make a living as sport fishing guides. So John Yeager, he's on the right. He lives in Wrangell near the mouth of the transboundary Stikine River in southeast. And he takes people on his boat to fish for salmon in the ocean. And he tells me, I'm not so much trying to fill the freezers of my clients. I'm trying to fill their minds with memories. There are many firsts on my boat. First time in Alaska, first time catching a salmon, or first time fishing with a grandchild. I like that I can provide experiences that will stay with people forever. So John grew up in a small town in Ohio, and his family owned a grocery store. And he tells me that when he was young, if he wanted ice cream or T-bone steaks, he'd just go to the family store and grab what he needed. There was no exchange of money. And he never really understood where food came from or what it took to get it. And when he came to Alaska, he married into a family that homesteaded on the Stikine River and fishes and hunts as a way of life. And he says, living the way we do in Alaska, I think a lot about food, especially salmon. When my family catches a salmon, we give some to my wife's parents and to an elderly neighbor, and then we share the rest together. We've done the job the fish wanted us to do with it. That's important. It's not just the sustenance of the fish, it's the spirit of the fish. Heidi Wild, shown here with her 14-year-old son Lane. She is a sport fishing guide in Bristol Bay, and so she takes clients all over this immense region to fish for salmon and trout. She guides March through October, and so she sees salmon at both the beginning and the end of their lives. And she says, the moment that salmon eggs hatch, the fight to survive and thrive is on. The fish make their way to the ocean, and they face limitless perils. They stay gone until they're called home. They don't quit swimming in the middle of their return home simply because they face obstacles. They keep moving forward, tirelessly, devoted, inspiring, just like most of us. So Heidi, myself, and 2 others, we fly in a small float plane, soaring over the vast tundra with its countless creeks, lakes, and rivers. It's late August, and while the frenzy of the Bristol Bay commercial fishing season for people ended in mid-July, the frenzy of the spawning season for salmon is in full swing in the many tributaries upstream from the mouth of the bay. The pilot lands on a lake, and we hike to a creek jammed with tomato red sockeye, nearing the end of their lives. But we're not here for the salmon. We're here because of salmon. So rainbow and Dolly Varden trout grow big and fat here, feasting on salmon eggs, salmon carcasses, and the young salmon that emerge in the spring. We cross the creek and a wall of crimson sockeye opens and streams along both sides of us. The water sings with the riffles of the shallows and the ripples of the salmon swaying in the current. We cast into the water, into our minds, fishing for whatever this way comes. Few words are exchanged. The shared connection to the land, the fish, and the crisp air bonds us together better than words ever could. Time slows. What matters is what's happening now, not what happened years ago or what might happen tomorrow. Heidi peers toward the bank of the creek and she says, "Is that a bear?" My inner calm is disrupted by her voice, but all that matters is what's happening now. And what's happening now is that a bear has come between our group. Not an ideal scenario, and it's one that we've been very careful to avoid happening all day. He creeps into the creek and he turns broadside to us. Those of you who are very familiar with bears, you know that this is a polite and rather effective way of intimidating his neighbors by showing us his size. So we give the bear space and he ambles upstream a little ways. He stops and he turns broadside again. I think he's telling us that we've overstayed our welcome in his dining room. So we clump together and we splash across the creek. Salmon bodies thrash against our legs. Our boots hit the dry ground. We begin to scramble up a steep bank, bashing through a wall of willows. And finally, we reach the top. And then the laughter begins. Laughter at the bushwhack up the bank, laughter at ourselves for fleeing the scene, and laughter because it's exhilarating to be in this staggeringly beautiful place, sharing this world-class moment with new friends. So, as you all know here in Alaska, bears and salmon go together, and so do many other species that salmon benefit. At every stage of their life cycle, salmon are a life force that feeds something. That salmon circle of life radiates to support at least 50 different species in Alaska. You spend enough time around salmon and you realize that they're in everything. They're in bears, birds, marine mammals, and people. They're even in trees. And if you don't know how this happens, I'll briefly explain it. And I hope for those of you who don't, I hope you're scratching your heads and just saying, what do you mean there's salmon in trees? How the heck does that happen? Well, Is this how it happens? Is this salmon in the trees? No, technically this is salmon up a tree. So how the heck does salmon get in the trees? Well, in the Great Salmon Forest, right here in southeast Alaska, scientists have found high concentrations of a nitrogen variant in trees near salmon streams. This variant is called nitrogen 15, and it primarily comes from the ocean. So how did it find its way from the sea into the forest? Well, it swam there, in the bodies of spawning salmon loaded with marine nutrients from their time at sea. But how then does it get into the trees? Well, bears have a lot to do with this. Now, bears don't particularly like being around other bears, so when they catch a fish, they will often carry it away from the stream and into the forest. And it turns out that bears can move a lot of salmon into the forest. Researchers say that one bear can carry 40 fish from a stream in just 8 hours. And toward the end of a good salmon season, bears can afford to be picky, and at that point, they're usually targeting just the richest parts of the fish, and they leave the rest behind. Certainly doesn't go to waste. Other animals scavenge on these carcasses, and this spreads the nutrients farther throughout the forest. Well, and guess what happens? All of this rich fish fertilizer decomposes into the soil, and the trees and other vegetation then absorb it through their roots. And scientists have actually traced nitrogen 15 in trees near salmon streams that they can link back to the fish. And that is how salmon end up in the trees. Now, how cool is that? It's so cool. I did an entire book on this topic called What Else? Salmon in the Trees. And I still can't stop talking about it. But for this book, The Salmon Way, a lot of people have asked me how I made this cover photo. And no, this is not photoshopped. This is the real deal. So I had this idea in my mind that I wanted to make a photograph that spoke to the concept of salmon as a life force. But this is difficult to capture and show in a photograph when the salmon are still alive. So somehow I needed to make a photograph of a live, vibrant salmon providing life for something else. And so in an attempt to do this, I went to Mcneil River. If you don't know where that is, it's on the northeast side of the Alaska Peninsula. And if you haven't been there, highly, highly recommend going. I think it's just a phenomenal place to view bears. And there's a story in the book about my time here at Mcneil, and I'd like to read just a part of it to you now. Weighing more than half a ton, a bear named Rocky ambles toward me. He has scars on his face and shoulders and tattered skin on his sides. He's a fighter, hence his name, and he's healthy. His belly almost scrapes the ground. His enormous head melds into his massive girth, and each paw is bigger than my head. He's hungry. Fortunately for Rocky and me, there's a river full of fish just steps from where he stands, and I sit at the Mcneil River State Game Sanctuary. Established in 1967, the 200-square-mile sanctuary is protected wildlife habitat and home to the world's largest congregation of brown bears. As many as 144 individuals have been identified in a single summer, with 74 bears observed at one time. From early July through mid-August, chum salmon return to the Mcneil River to spawn. A mile upstream from the river's mouth, the Mcneil River Falls create a salmon traffic jam, providing excellent fishing opportunities for bears and outstanding bear viewing experiences for humans. And that's why I'm here, along with 9 other lucky Homo sapiens who won 4-day bear viewing permits in a lottery system through the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So if it weren't for salmon, we wouldn't be here. If it weren't for salmon, people who came to Mcneil long before it was designated a wildlife sanctuary probably wouldn't have been here either. The camp where we pitched our tents is pocked with shallow depressions in the ground, evidence of semi-subterranean dwellings of people who were most likely nomadic. I can envision them arriving in the summer to harvest salmon. Perhaps they took steam baths fueled by driftwood from the beach, not far from today's wood-fired sauna overlooking a lily pond. They would have shared food, chores, and laughter, not unlike us, sharing peanut butter, hauling water, and swapping stories. While they didn't come here to watch bears, they undoubtedly viewed them with respect. Everything we do, eat, sleep, walk, and talk, is done with respect for the bears and their home. We sit quietly near the roaring river. Rocky faces the falls in solid defiance of the oncoming water, tumbling over the boulders and swirling past his legs. He darts his head into the churning water and emerges triumphant with a flopping fish. It's a female, and as the clamp of the big Bruin's teeth forces the eggs from her body, in that moment, her life force is transferred to his. Watching the age-old scene of predator pursuing prey in a setting devoid of roads, motorized vehicles, crowds of people, or cell phone coverage triggers something deep within us. That wild part of our DNA, long dormant, awakens from its domesticated slumber. Places like the Mcneil Sanctuary make us feel alive, not because we're seeking a thrill, but because what we didn't know we were missing reintroduces itself. Connecting to our true nature makes us whole. So I think that many people are drawn to salmon. I know that I am, because in salmon, we see ourselves. Salmon show all who encounter them that life is a dance of rhythms, balance, and strength. Through twists and turns, ups and downs, we learn to trust the unseen and bow with grace for the time we are here. From the fish, we learn what it means to be a part of the world, what it means to be human, and what it means to just be. Salmon are a gift, and I was told that over and over again. They're a gift to the land, water, animals, plants, and people. And when you're on the receiving end of a gift, you give thanks and you give back. It's the Salmon Way. Everywhere I went, from remote villages to urban cities, whether I met with people for 10 minutes or 10 days, I always seemed to leave with salmon in my hands. And I was so touched by the generosity that the salmon people showed me. I learned that sharing is the Alaska way, and that it goes beyond food and includes sharing firewood, laughter, sweat, and tears. And this generosity of spirit forges relationships, and relationships create communities. And throughout my travels, I asked people another question. I said, what would your life be like without salmon? And pretty much everyone gave me the same answer. Without salmon, there would be no community. That's what salmon do. They connect us to each other, to a home stream, and to our true nature. Emma Lakaitis, she's a young commercial fisherman from Homer, and she and her sister founded the company Salmon Sisters. And she says, salmon have given all Alaskans a common language, a set of values, and something to believe in and hope for. Reuben Hastings, he's a young Alaska native sport fishing guide from Bristol Bay, and he says, watching salmon, you see that life isn't just a straight line that ends at the finish line. Both Emma and Reuben hope that their generation and beyond can continue the salmon way of life. Now, for many Alaskans who don't make their living from salmon or live a subsistence way of life, their connection to salmon still runs deep, catching their own fish and sharing the bounty with others. Because food always tastes best when it's shared. And that's why we brought you food here this evening. And now I wish more than anything that I could live this salmon way of life where I live in Washington State. Now, when I look at this map, I feel both pain and hope. Now, much of the hope lies north in Alaska, but let's talk about the pain first. The once staggering runs of salmon in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and southern British Columbia are now, today, less than 10% of their historical abundance. How did this happen? Well, beginning in the late 1700s, an increasingly industrial way of life systematically decimated salmon and their habitat, creek by creek, river by river, watershed by watershed. And a culture that valued short-term profits and commodities dominated cultures that valued long-term relationships with their natural communities. Damming rivers to power factories and energy grids, dumping toxic waste into waterways, diverting water from rivers to irrigate crops, overfishing, and deforestation. These are just a handful of the crimes against salmon that led to their demise. Now, plenty of people objected, but the voices of those who stood for salmon were steamrolled. And when the salmon vanished, entire ways of life went with them. The gift of salmon was gone, and the relationships, communities, and cultures were lost. So this is the Columbia River. This is 66 miles from its mouth along the border of Washington and Oregon. The 1,200-mile Columbia River, this was once one of the greatest salmon-producing systems on Earth. And like many of the lower 48 rivers where salmon once thrived, we lost salmon in the Columbia due to a number of factors: overharvest, habitat destruction, hydroelectric dams, and substituting hatcheries for habitat. At 146 miles from the mouth of the Columbia, this is the Bonneville Dam. And this was the first of many built on this river. And at the dam's visitor center, there's an exhibit that talks about dam construction and what the dam brought to the region. And one sign in the exhibit in particular stands out to me. What is wealth, living, and happiness? And who decides? The native people, whose entire way of life was connected to this free-flowing river, who gathered for millennia for the seasonal bounty of salmon and to renew ties with family and friends, how would they define wealth, living, and happiness? When we overfished, dammed, and polluted the mighty Columbia, we traded one form of wealth for another. We traded a way of life for another. We may have gained things, I can't argue that, but we also lost. A river without its salmon is a river without its soul. And this story has repeated itself most everywhere in the world where there were salmon on both sides of the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. Now, let's talk about hope. So you've seen how the salmon people of Alaska define wealth, living, and happiness. A full smokehouse, a connection to a home stream and community, gathering with family and friends, sharing the seasonal bounty, and passing all of this to the next generations. There's a strong belief among Alaska natives that if they respect the salmon, the fish will come back every year and give themselves to the people. I think that's the basis for any healthy relationship: respect. If we want these salmon relationships to continue, we have to continue to respect salmon and give them what they need: clean, cool, healthy fresh water to spawn and rear, and a thriving ocean to mature. I'd like to just point out a couple people that I spent some time with who are working to ensure that salmon have a future in Alaska. This is Sue Mauger, and she's a stream ecologist and the science director for the Cook Inlet Keeper. This is an organization that works to conserve the Cook Inlet watershed and the life that it supports. And in 2008, Sue and Cook Inlet Keeper, they coordinated a team of state and federal agencies, as well as nonprofit and community groups, to create and implement a stream temperature monitoring network in the Cook Inlet watershed. And she's also helping people set this up in the Bristol Bay watershed as well. So as cold-blooded creatures, salmon depend on the water temperature of their environment for the regulation of their body temperature. And Sue helped me understand what happens to the fish when water temperatures rise, something that occurred this summer with record temperatures throughout the state, and something we might see more of in the future with a changing climate. So She told me that water temperatures above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, this brings increasing stress to salmon. Above 68 degrees, the fish are less likely to avoid predators and successfully spawn. And at 77 degrees and higher, they don't have the energy to spawn and survive the freshwater phase of their life. So understanding which stream systems across a landscape are prone to warming and which are likely to remain unchanged will help land managers prioritize conservation strategies to increase the resiliency of salmon to a changing climate. This is critically important work. Another person I spent time with is Ted Otis. He's there on the left, and he's a research biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And I spent time with him and other folks in the department throughout the state to get an idea of what they do to manage salmon. I mean, I really had no idea how you manage salmon. And I learned just how much information and data is behind any decision to allow or restrict fishing. So things like fish forecasts, test fisheries, escapement reports, genetic analyses, historical records, and much more. And Ted helped me understand that Alaska still has abundant salmon runs in general because the habitat remains largely intact, and that's really the key. And he also stressed how important genetic diversity is to salmon, and he cited Bristol Bay as a great example, diverse salmon habitat that fosters stability within and across salmon populations, making them more resilient to any kind of environmental change. And I need to add, the time that I spent throughout the state with the men and women of Fish and Game made me realize that they often work in very challenging conditions, sometimes very dangerous, and it can be a thankless job at times. But everyone I met was passionate about making sure that Alaska is a place where there will always be salmon to catch. And in fact, Alaska is really one of the few places left in the world where salmon can still thrive, where salmon people live connected to the fish with an appreciation for what nourishes both body and spirit. And while I set out to tell stories in my book that celebrate the Salmon Way, there's also a cautionary tale to tell. And I had plenty of conversations with people about their worries, for the future when it comes to salmon. And just a few of the areas in the state that are threatened in some way. This is Bristol Bay, home to the world's largest run of sockeye salmon, and it's threatened by the proposed Pebble Mine. And if built, it will be the world's largest open pit gold mine situated at the headwaters of two of the most important rivers that feed Bristol Bay. The transboundary rivers here in Southeast, these are threatened by pollution from current and proposed Canadian mining operations. And in some parts of the state, there are salmon runs that are not faring so well, including those of the Kuskokwim and the Yukon rivers. And there are always new proposals to dam, dredge, and degrade more salmon habitat, including building new roads right here in the Tongass National Forest. But Alaska is a place where history doesn't have to repeat itself, where salmon still endure, where we have an incredible opportunity to leave a salmon-filled legacy. And throughout my travels, I asked everyone how he or she values salmon, and not a single person responded with financial figures. Instead, all of the answers spoke to the relationship instead of the resource. And it didn't matter if the people I asked the question to fish for their food, livelihood, or fun. Everyone pretty much gave me the same answers: family, community, culture, well-being, and way of life. Values too precious to reduce to dollars and cents, and senseless to try. So to me, the message was loud and clear: the true worth of salmon, priceless. And today, it's worth celebrating and defending that Alaska is still a place where salmon are the lifeblood, where the Salmon Way is still a way of life. And so I dedicate this talk and my book to the salmon people. May your lives always pulse with the beauty and mystery of your home streams. And to the salmon, may you always come home. And to all of you, I leave you with the greatest lesson that salmon have taught me. Life's short. Be a life force with the time you're given, and give it everything you've got. Thank you. So we'd like to open it up to questions, and please don't be shy. Someone always has a question. Maybe someone doesn't.
Just beautiful, thank you.
You're welcome.
Are any legislators left in the room?
Yes.
Okay. Could you help us understand the bills that have been introduced that would strip away the designation, the surface designation, so that the land would be available for development?
KJ, I'm not sure which bill you're talking about. Are you talking about water protections, the Tier 3 protections that we're trying to stop a very bad bill from happening? I moved up here.
Yeah, it was it came up in the hearing on the Thunder Bay bill, and Colgill said that we want to strip away all the land designations that impede development, like critical habitat and some of those others. And I understood there was a bill that was introduced to do that.
I think it's the inverse. Well, okay. I'll try not to be too partisan because we're being broadcast. Maybe you've heard the governor's mantra of "we're open for business," and perhaps you might have heard some of my colleagues speak about the burdens of development that we've put on all Alaska's commercial enterprises for decades, as if we haven't developed mining and oil and gravel pits. But there are viewpoints, there are elected officials that I serve with that view any restrictions or any requirements of reporting or processing or standards of clean water or habitat protections as onerous burdens that they shouldn't be held to. Now that's, I can't think of any specific bill, but I will say that from some of our viewpoints, the federal requirement under the Environmental Protection Act and Clean Water Act to preserve waters using a process of Tier 3 protections for outstanding national waterways, Alaska's never achieved. There has been a lot of work on legislation surrounding that this year, but I have raised the question at, for instance, one of the waterways that's nominated to be a Tier 3 protection is the Chilkat River, which has a state park on it, a critical habitat on it, and an eagle preserve on it, and none of those current land protections forestall a mine from being permitted further up the river. So sort of the realization is we can protect certain lands for certain things, but that doesn't give us protection that the habitat is the highest priority. So the fight's never over.
Any other questions? All right, going once. Going twice. Again, and I'll be out in the lobby signing books if anyone's interested. And again, please stay for some delicious salmon snacks, locally provided. And again, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.